morning, dear learners, and welcome to the MOOC on Economics of Gender and Development. And we are in week 4, and this is module 12, and this module is on gender in the traditional society with special reference to India. So from our previous discussion, we have come to know that traditionally gender is viewed as a complex cultural product that function as social agents, having certain rules, altering symbols and concepts while linking people to particular societal standards. So in different national and religious systems, these rules are evidently distinct and upheld by considerable social pressures. Historical and cross-cultural studies indicate that each culture has established norms for males and females, which are communicated through contemporary media, educational systems, and religious doctrines to socialize individuals and convey cultural patterns. So traditional assumptions often perpetuate the myth of man the hunter, quote and unquote, versus woman the child bearer and nurturer, quote and unquote, in primitive societies. However, anthropological studies of early metristic societies suggest that women played critical roles in food collection, distribution, and small game hunting. So evidence indicates that gathering fruits and edible materials, an activity primarily conducted by women, supplied a major portion of the diet, I mean the family diet, around 65%, while hunting accounted for only 35%. And on the other hand, technology and tool making were not exclusively masculine innovations, and women were central to the Neolithic revolution. As societies transitioned to one pre-industrial agriculture, women contributed to 60% of the total labor. Yet, older men began to dominate for group cohesion, forming the basis of patriarchal society with social stratifications. So in this module, we shall try to examine how gender is viewed across the space with examples from certain countries or regions like the US, the Caribbean, the Arab countries, and the Asian region. Then we shall try to discuss the construct of gender in religions dimensions. And finally, we shall try to discuss the traditional views on gender from the Indian perspectives. Now, looking at the gender in the American society, how we view gender in American society. In traditional American society, gender roles have historically cast women as homemakers, responsible for child care and household chores, while men function as the breadwinners involved in physical labor and strategic planning. While modern families have moved towards sharing these responsibilities, traditional biases pre-exist in several forms. For example, a think manager, think males bias remains prevalent in US corporate environments where men contribute to be portrayed in roles providing economic security. When we analyze the cross-cultural aspects of magazine advertisements in the American society context, we find that American women are more likely than their international counterparts to be shown in decorative or social roles. In contrast, US men are frequently depicted in independent and working roles. Evolutionary psychological research within the US context also suggests that individuals with more male descendant kin tend to hold more conservative attitudes towards gender issues, such as opposing abortion rights or supporting traditional social structures where men hold more power. Now, despite legislative strides towards equality, a significant gender pay gap persists in the US, including in academia. Traditional expectations focus on human capital and structural factors, yet even when controlling for education and experience, women often earn less than men. This suggests that silly cultures, quote and unquote, and shifting standards of judgment continue to discount the qualifications of women in high-paying sectors. Now, looking from the Caribbean region, we see a stark example of how gender definitions are historically differentiated. In that context, femininity was deeply fractured by race and class. Elite white women sought to exclude black and brown females from the category of womanhood to maintain their own social privileges. White female travelers often described enslaved black women as masculine or brutish, placing them outside the pale of feminine sensitivity to justify their forced labor. Consequently, black women face the power of the master in ultimate loneliness, as gender identity offered them no protection from white society. Now, looking from the Arab world, how gender privilege and cultural norms in those countries, we see that traditional gender views in Arab societies, especially within Palestinian-Israeli context, are characterized by a male-dominated reality rife with issues of gender privilege. Girls are often socialized to believe that their highest aspirations should be marriage and motherhood, rather than pursuing personal professional dreams. School to textbooks frequently reinforce these views by portraying female characters primarily as housewives performing chores. Now, from the Central Asian region, we find that in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, gender views are shaped by intersection of Islam, patriarchy, and the legacy of Soviet rule. The Soviet era successfully advanced women's literacy and labor force participation, yet the government continued to emphasize motherhood as women's most vital role. This forced Central Asian women to adopt a triple identity, within quote and unquote, as workers, housekeepers, and tradition keepers. So, in the post-Soviet period, nation-building projects have often used gender to construct public patriarchy, where women play secondary roles in nationalist narratives and are expected to maintain ethnic and cultural boundaries. Private patriarchy also remains strong, particularly in patrilocal households where a woman moves in with her husband's parents. So, in such settings, older women sometimes act as agents of the patriarchal system, participating in the coercion of younger women into forced marriages or encouraging sons to discipline their wives. Latent class analysis reveals that while some women hold egalitarian views, a significant portion hold dual views, supporting women's advancement in society while simultaneously maintaining that men should be the primary breadwinners. Now let us look into the nexus of religion and gender across faiths. Religious frameworks provide a critical lens for interpreting gender roles in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. While some scholars view these traditions as rigidly patriarchal, others see them as providing essential marital and family support. A nearly universal theme across these religions is gender hierarchy, often traced back to religious texts like the Garden of Eden narrative. So, in Christianity, the concept of male headship remains influential, particularly in evangelical traditions, though it is often criticized while misapplied as toxic fate, quote unquote, or male chauvinism. In Orthodox Judaism, traditional roles like caring for children are sometimes viewed as inherent to a woman's nature and a natural part of her development. Interestingly, Jewish tradition also establishes the Ona, quote unquote, which grants women specific rights to sexual enjoyment within marriage, highlighting a form of empowerment within a traditional framework. And in Islam, scholars argue that the Quran emphasizes spiritual and intellectual equality, though cultural practices often diverge toward more restrictive norms. However, in highly religious Muslim families in the Middle East countries, gender boundaries are often framed as protective barriers, with modest women like the hijab seen as a way to safeguard chastity and prevent sexual temptation. So, across all these faiths, the sanctity of gender is often emphasized, suggesting that the union of man and woman creates a divine designed wholeness that requires different but complementary roles. Thus, from the above discussion, we have seen that traditional views on gender remain deeply entrenched across diverse country contexts, though they are increasingly challenged by globalization and modern feminist thought. While the US continue to grapple with several professional biases, Central Asian and Arab societies navigate complex intersections of religion and post-Soviet or post-colonial identity. These sources suggest that while advertising and media promote a new woman, quote and unquote, and legislative acts guarantee rights, the ingrained notions of women as domestic caretakers or financial burdens continue to influence the lived experiences of millions. Now, in the next section, we shall examine how gender in traditional views from the Indian perspectives. Now, looking at gender in ancient India, the modern debate about lives of women in ancient India did not begin in a university or a library discussions. It was sparked by a political collision, the British colonial encounter with India. This encounter framed what came to be known as the woman question, quote and unquote, and set the terms of the discussion for a century. Now, looking at the gender constructs in India, at the philosophical and social historical foundation, we see that in the Indian context, traditional gender views are deeply rooted in ancient and sacred literature, defining a traditional role for women characterized by subservience to man. Women are historically expected to perform as caring and dutiful wives, mothers, and daughters-in-law, providing their moral virtue by standing by their men to maintain family harmony. Conversely, Indian men are traditionally viewed as the primary providers of economic security. This patriarchal ideal is encapsulated in the concept of Pativrata Dharma, which emphasizes a wife's willful surrender and unflinching devotion to her husband as a recurrent trope in Hindu mythology. Scholarly critics of ancient Indian texts, like the Manusmriti and the Dharmasastras, reveal that these prescriptive works often categorized women as the lowest levels of the socio-economic religious hierarchy alongside the Sudras. For instance, certain legal codes prohibited women from becoming ascetics or studying the Vedas, restricting their primary purpose to domestic activities and service to man. For example, in the Ramayana, the character of Sita is frequently held up as the ideal for feminine behavior as she internalizes her grief and demonstrates unwavering devotion to Rama. This cultural model of male dominance and female submission has served to secure hierarchies among both humans and deities. Furthermore, the concept of kartavya, quote and unquote, that is duty, plays a critical role in the Indian familial structure. Research indicates that even when individuals recognize the unfairness of certain gender restrictions, they often prioritize community and family harmony over individual autonomy. For example, many families still believe that a daughter-in-law should forego employment opportunities if they conflict with her husband's career or the domestic needs of the household. This gendered understanding of duty reinforces the notion that the home is a woman's bastion, while the public sphere remains the primary domain of men. Now, looking at the colonial gaze, we see that for British colonial administrators and missionaries, the status of Indian women became a powerful tool for justifying imperial rule. They argued that the supposedly poor condition of women was an index of civilization, quote and unquote, proof that Indian society was backward and in need of saving. The past of the colonized people was denigrated and characterized as feminine, weak, and unable to govern itself. By portraying Indian women as oppressed and in the need of rescue, the British could nationalize their colonial enterprise as a moral and civilizing mission. Now, there was a defensive response to this, of British suppositions. In response to this colonial critique, Indian male reformers and nationalists developed a powerful counter-narrative. They conceptually divided the world into two distinct spheres, a strategy that allowed them to engage with modernity while protecting what they saw as the core of their cultural identity. First was the outer or public world. This was the world of politics, science, and the economy. it was seen as a masculine, materialistic, and temporarily dominated by the British. Indian men, they argued, had to learn and master the ways of this world to eventually defeat the colonizers. Second was the inner or the private world. This was the world of the home and the spirit. It was defined as feminine, spiritual, and a protected domain of authentic Indian tradition. Here a new woman was constructed as educated but devoted to her domestic and religious duties. She became a powerful symbol, a symbolic pawn, within quote and unquote, in the nationalist discourse, representing the uncorrupted soul of the nation that the British could not touch. So this division was a pragmatic concession. Nationalists could accept British dominance in the material world of politics and economics, while fiercely protecting the home as the sanctum of a superior, unconquered Indian spirituality. This defensive posture set the stage for a generation of historians who sought not just to encounter the colonial narrative, but to build a glorious past of their own. Crafting a glorious past, the golden age of the Vedic woman. Now, fueled by the nationalist response, critical to the British arguments, a new generation of Indian historians embarked on a mission to reclaim the past. Their goal was to prove that the subjugation of women was not an inherent feature of Hindu society, but a later corruption. They did this by constructing the powerful ideas of a Vedic golden age. Prominent nationalist historians like R.C. Dutt aim to resurrect the lost glory of Indian womanhood, quote and unquote. They turned to the most ancient religious text, the Vedas, and presented a sanitized interpretation of them. As the later scholars pointed out, this project was highly selective. It chose to focus on the sacrificial virtues and spirituality of idealized Vedic women rather than asking critical questions about what might have been wrong with their actual conditions. So this narrative of a lost golden age was not just an academic theory, it was a powerful political tool. This idealization of a Vedic golden age served a crucial purpose. It absolved Hindu society of any inherently oppressive characteristics. By this logic, patriarchal institutions were not indigenous, but were merely a response to external threats to Hindu women. This idealist view was not only promoted by male nationalists. Early women writers such as Mrs. Fair and the French author Clarice Bader also wrote works that valorized the epic heroism of Vedic women. While seemingly supportive, this trend was later critiqued by scholars like Uma Chakraborty as a second round of Orientalism, quote unquote, a romanticized and ultimately uncritical view of the past that reinforced stereotypes rather than challenging them. So while the idea of a lost golden age was popular, it was one scholar in particular who cement this as a rise and fall, quote unquote, story into the dominant historical paradigms for decades to come. The most influential and systematic account of the Golden Age theory came from the historian A.S. Altekar. His work became the standard textbook understanding of women's history in ancient India for many years, creating what is now known as Altekarian paradigms. The seminal work. In his 1938 book, The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, Altekar provided a comprehensive narrative that gave academic weight to the nationalist ideal. He presented a seemingly authoritative history of women's status from the Vedic period to his own time. Altekar's history was a simple but powerful story of linear decline. He argued that the history of Hindu womanhood could be divided into three distinct phases. The Golden Age. According to Altekar, the Vedic period from century 1500 to 500 BCE was time of high status for women. He claimed that they enjoyed good education similar to men, a high age of marriage, rights alongside their husbands in the home, and freedom from practices like sati, widow immolation, and seclusion or pada. the decline. From the time of the Sutras, between 500 BC to 200 CE to onwards, Alticus argued women's status began a long and steady decline. He claimed that their position was progressively reduced until it was equivalent to that of the Sudras, the lowest of the four major social orders in Indian system. Now the cause. Alticus contributed that decline is a specific historical event, the introduction of non-Aryan wives into Aryan households. He argued that this intermingling of cultures led to a lowering of standards and a subsequent restriction of women's freedoms. This explanation is revealing, as it projects contemporary anxieties about caste purity and cultural assimilation back into the ancient past, framing the decline not as an integral social development but as a result of external radical contamination. For many years, the Alticarian paradigm was the standard history, but its neat story of decline rested on a reading of ancient texts that a new generation of historians would begin to question profoundly. In the post-independence period, a new wave of scholarship emerged that fundamentally challenged the old nationalist narratives. Led by feminist historians like Uma Chakrabarti and Kumkum Roy, this new approach did not just want to correct the facts, it wanted to ask entirely new questions. Asking the questions, what are the major questions? The most crucial sense was a shift in focus. Instead of simply charting the status of women on a timeline of rise and fall, these scholars began to analyze the deep structures of patriarchal social formations within the Indian society. They wanted to understand how patriarchy was created and maintained through the complex interplay of state, family, class, caste, and religious institutions. They treated the ancient texts not as windows into the past, but as complex, biased documents that needed to be read critically. So now looking at the Alticarian approach versus this new feminist approach, you can see this in table 1. We make a comparison between this and you can see the table 1. Here, first point is how should we read the ancient text? The Alticarian approach is that as relatively straightforward reflections of society, the biases of the male authors are not treated as a central problem. And in the modern feminist approach, they view it as problematic, allied, male authored text, and we must read into the silences to find women's voices and understand patriarchal anxieties. Now with regard to what is the central story, in the Alticarian approach we see that a simple decline from the Vedic golden age caused by external influences. And in the modern feminist approach we see that it is a complex story of how patriarchy was constructed and maintained through ideology, religion, state, and family structures. With regard to what is the role of caste, the Alticarian approach said that it was a threat, the Sudra woman, that contributed to the decline of Aryan women's status, while the modern feminist approach view it as intrinsic to patriarchy. Gender rules were created to control women's sexuality and thereby maintain caste purity. Then where do we find women's voices? In the Alticarian approach we see that primarily in the idealist portraits found in Brahmanical text. And in the modern feminist approach we see that by looking at alternative sources like the Buddhist texts such as the Tirthagatha and the Jatakas, which features nuns and women who defy marriage's forms, and by reinterpreting compliance and resistance as forms of women's agency. Now what is the historian's primary goal? The Alticarian approach, the primary goal was to reclaim national honor and construct a glorious, unblemished Hindu past as a political counter-narrative to colonialism. And the primary goal of the modern feminist approach is to deconstruct systems of power and understand how patriarchy as an ideology intersecting with caste and class was created and maintained. Now looking at the key insights of the feminist approach, we see that the new scholarship produced groundbreaking insights that reshape the field. Two of the most important contributors of this feminist approach are, one is the patriarchy is intersectional. Feminist historians demonstrated that gender relations are deeply intertwined with class and caste. The subordination of women, they argued, was not a separate issue, but was essential for maintaining the purity of the Varna, that is caste, system. Controlling women's sexuality through ideologies like Stree Dharma, the duties of women, was the primary mechanism for maintaining and reproducing social and caste hierarchies. So, uncovering women's agency, we see that this new approach refused to see women as passive victims. For the first time, texts like the Buddhist Therigatha, the earliest known texts authored by women, were seen as vital sources. In one song, a dasi, a female slave, named Punna, logically dismantles a Brahman's ritual bathing by pointing out that if water washed away sin, then all the frogs and fish must be going straight to heaven. This was a revolutionary shift. Scholars began to look for women's agency, their capacity to act, even in small acts of intellectual defiance, compliance, or negotiation, reinterpreting them as survival tactics and ways of bargaining with patriarchy. This critical re-examination completely changed the field, moving the historical writing from a simple story of decline to a complex analysis of power, ideology, and identity. Now let us conclude the discussion. So as we have seen, our understanding of women in ancient India is not a single settled fact, but a narrative with its own history, and we have traced its path. It began with the colonial women question, where women's status was used to justify British rule. This provoked a nationalist Golden Age myth, a defensive but idealized counter-narrative. This myth was codified by the Althusserian paradigm, which told a simple story of decline that dominated for decades. Finally, this was overturned by modern feminist historians who asked new questions about patriarchy, caste, and power, transforming the very way we study the past. So the major things we have learned in this module are: the most important lesson in this journey is that historiography is not just about discovering what happened. It is about understanding how we know what we know and recognizing that the questions we ask of the past are profoundly shaped by the concerns of the present. The story of women in ancient India is still being written. As scholars continue to challenge old assumptions and explore the plurality of past experiences, our understanding will continue to evolve. The conversation is far from over, reminding us that the historian's most important tool is not the answer, but the question. So thank you. So with this, we come to the end of this module, and let's meet in the next module, module number 30. Thank you.